Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa baraka wa sallama tasliman kathiran ila yawmiddin amma ba'd. إن الذين قالوا ربنا الله ثم استقاموا تتنزل عليهم الملائكة ألا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا وأبشروا بالجنة التي كنتم توعدون نحن أولياؤكم في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة ولكم فيها ما تشتهي أنفسكم ولكم فيها ما تدعون نزلا من غفور رحيم. Dear friends, nice to be with you here today, this evening. And this is a wonderful series that has been initiated here, and it's my honor to be here to deliver the first of these series on the great Imam al-aʿẓam Abū Ḥanīfa al-Nuʿmān ibn Thabit al-Kufi. The reason is that the majority of the Muslim world today, they, for whatever reason it is, they have some kind of affinity with one of these four Imams at some level of the other. We're talking about after about, you can say, 12 to 1300 years since these Imams, and they were not all contemporaries, and I'll explain that just to set the scene for you afterwards. But for over 10 centuries, 11, 12, up to 13 centuries, there have been people who have been influenced by these four. And there was no agreement that, okay, I'm going to choose, that the Prophet ﷺ said, I'm going to choose these four people. I mean, these people never met the Prophet ﷺ. The earliest of the four is clearly Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, rahimahullah. He was born in 80 Hijri. So 80 Hijri is, you can say, the beginning, towards the beginning of the Abbasids. It's obviously 80 years after the migration of the Prophet ﷺ, and you've got some Sahaba left, you've got some companions left, and this is pretty much agreed upon that Imam Abū Ḥanīfa met at least one companion, if not several. And the one he is known to have for certain met is Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu, who was actually the personal assistant of the Prophet ﷺ from about the age of 10 until the Prophet ﷺ, for about 10 years until the Prophet ﷺ passed away, most of his Medinan life. So he was very privy to the Prophet ﷺ's home and his lifestyle and everything. And the Prophet ﷺ had once made a very special dua for him, for which reason he actually stayed alive for a very long time. And he said he personally buried so many of his own children and grandchildren who died before him. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa met him, and it's possible he met a number of others, has been related as well. And there's also a possibility that he's also transmitted directly from the Sahaba, though that's not proven beyond question. Why are we speaking about having met a Sahabi? Because as we may know, there's a bit of a hierarchy in the early generations. So the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, خَيْرُكُمْ قَرْنِي, the best of you is my generation, which basically speaks about everybody that saw the Prophet ﷺ, so all the companions, the Sahaba. Then he says, so خَيْرُكُمْ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ, then those who will come after them, and then those who will follow them. So we're talking about 3 generations. And of course, this is a bit of a diminishing hierarchy. So the Sahaba, the companions that saw the Prophet ﷺ, they have some very specific qualities and excellences about them. And then they're followed by those who studied by them or saw them while in a state of Iman. And then followed by the third level. So the Sahaba are called companions. Companions are called Sahaba. Then those who followed them, the next generation is called the Tabi'een or Tabi'un, which means followers, successors. And then the third generation is called Atba'ut Tabi'een or Tab'ut Tabi'i in a singular, which basically means the followers of the followers, the successors of the successors. essentially for these three people, because the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that they are the khayrukum. Khayr means the most excellent among you, the best among you, the most virtuous among you. That means they have been born witness with what they call khayriyah, or goodness or excellence, unlike us, right? As a whole generation. Of course, there's people in every generation that will have some kind of virtue and excellence depending on what they do, what they achieve, and what the state of their heart is. But these three generations were born witness about as a whole, which is quite amazing. So the higher the generation, the superior. So Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was certainly a tabi among the four Imams. Imam Malik, who was born about maybe within a decade or so after him, he was not considered a tabi'i. But Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was. Even though Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was actually in Kufa, and Imam Malik rahimahullah was actually in Medina Munawwara. Because by that time, many of the Sahaba were probably in Medina Munawwara, maybe passed away, and the others who were probably alive were probably in different parts of the world. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa then lived for a good age. He died eventually in 150 Hijri. So that means he was 70 years old when he passed away. Very interesting is that 150 Hijri is the same year in which Imam Shafi'i is born. So the only person who was actually a contemporary of Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was Imam Malik, who was born a decade or so after him, and obviously died a bit after him. That's why Imam Shafi'i, who was born in 150, gets to study at a very young age, about 9-10 years old. He gets to study with Imam Malik in his old age. And then comes Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who comes later. Imam Shafi'i was born in 150. He died in 203 or 4, right, Hijri. He was only about 50 something years old when he passed away. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal overlaps with him. Imam Ahmad studied with Imam Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad dies in 240 or 50 something, 240 something I think. So you can see there's a bit of a succession here. Now, why these four Imams? Why do we follow them? Why do most people have some kind of relationship to them? The fiqh that basically is considered to be the fiqh of the orthodox Muslim ummah, right, relates to these four. Why? There were actually a number of other so-called Imams who did what these four did as well. What did these four do? What they're primarily known today for. We're not going to focus, I just want to lay the foundation because this is the first lecture. What these four did essentially was that they codified the sharia, the fiqh, the jurisprudence. Essentially you had the Quran and you had Sunnah. Meaning you had the Quranic verses, you had the Sunnah, the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but they had to be distilled, they had to be extrapolated from, they had to be processed to derive the rulings from these so people could use them. Because not everything is so clear cut in the Quran and Sunnah. There are many things that are not mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah that we would need answers for. So what these Imams were trying to do is they were trying to analyze these traditions and trying to formulate rulings for us. Clearly, sometimes they differed. Because sometimes one is going to say you do it this way and another Imam's saying do it another way. Clearly they differed about that. And while they were all correct in their endeavor, because the Prophet ﷺ has said very clearly that when the judge or the jurist, the one who has the qualifications to undertake this kind of a analysis and in scholarly endeavor, when they undertake that scholarly endeavor to find the truth and they come up with a ruling, they formulate a ruling, if it is correct according to what is the reality according to Allah, then they actually end up getting 2 rewards. If they get it wrong, they won't know. They will think they're correct, that they formulated a ruling based on their analysis and their studies and their research. If that doesn't match up with what's the haqq and the truth according to Allah, they still get 1 reward. And the reason they get 1 reward is because their responsibility was to find a ruling. There's no website you can go and look at, there's no website, there's no trivia question or something where say, okay, that was actually right. Next week we're going to publish what's right and what's wrong according to Allah. Right? You're only going to find that out in the hereafter in terms of how much reward they get. Right? So that's just to give you a bit of a scholarly kind of understanding of how the dynamics behind it. But there were not just these four. Remember, I said these four were not always contemporaries. At the same time, there were others in different parts of the world doing the same thing. So you had Ibn Hazm al-Zahiri, right, who had a more literalist approach. You had Imam Awza'i, who was the great, they had no probably greater person in Sham, in Syria. He was the Imam of Syria. Just like Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was in Kufa. Imam Ahmad was in Basra. Imam Shafi'i probably started off originally from Gaza, went to Mecca, and he ended up in Egypt. He's buried there right now in Cairo, right? Imam Malik was in Medina Munawwara. What about the other great cities? So you had, in Egypt, you actually had Layth ibn Sa'd, right? Another great Imam there. And in Sham, you had a person called Imam al-Awza'i. Then you had Imam Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, right? The great Mufassir and historian. He also had a madhab in his time. But you know what happened over the centuries is that these madhabs, some of them did not survive. How does a madhab survive? What's a madhab? A school of law. That particular, these scholars that I've mentioned, the four Imams and all these others, they obviously came up and extrapolated a body of masail, a body of rulings, right? Now, for anything that I say, I have to either write a book or I have to teach several people. Otherwise, I'm gonna, whatever I've said, whatever knowledge I had is gonna die with me, right? That's quite a natural thing, isn't it? So you're gonna have to produce some papers, you're gonna have to write a book, you're going to have to give seminars, and you're going to have to be influential enough that people actually pick up from you and then proliferate your thought. So essentially for these other Imams, that didn't happen. Meaning for these other great scholars, it didn't happen. Their madhab, their school of law, their codifications, their body of laws that they had formulated did not carry on. Whereas for Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad, at varying different degrees, their madhabs endured until today. That's why if we look at the Muslim Ummah, proportionally speaking today, you could say that the overwhelming majority, if they're followers of a madhab, as the majority generally are, right, they're followers of the Hanafi school, followed by the Maliki school is actually probably has more followers than the Shafi'i school, because a lot of North Africa is Maliki, right, and that's a huge population there. Followed by the Shafi'i school is probably third, though the Shafi'i school in the West seems to be probably a bit more popular than the Maliki school. Well, actually probably about the same. So you have the Hanafis who probably have the greatest amount of following, followed by Malikis, followed by Shafi'is, followed by Hanbalis, right, who have probably the smallest amount of followers in that sense. And there's even those who are generally tend to be followers, there's very, very few who are, you can say, ardent followers of the Hanbali school. A lot of them tend to shift away in quite a few masail where, you know, they think that they've got a stronger opinion elsewhere. So it's not a very strong school in that sense, though it was obviously in the past. Now let's talk about Imam Abū Ḥanīfa. I just want to set the scene. So Imam Abū Ḥanīfa starts this off. What makes him so popular? We've got one statement by Imam Shafi'i himself. He says, الناس عيال على أبي حنيفة, right? Basically, fil fiqh, in jurisprudence, everybody is dependent on Imam Abū Ḥanīfa. Now that's quite an amazing statement that he makes, despite the fact that he doesn't take Imam Abū Ḥanīfa's views in everything, right? He clearly has respect for him, clearly praises him for this, but he has his own school, right? He studies with Imam Malik. His school is very different to Imam Malik's as well. So he's clearly got his own mind. He's a very independent thinker, there's no doubt about it. But what then makes him say that people are dependent on Imam Abū Ḥanīfa in their fiqh? So one of the ways to understand that is that Imam Abū Ḥanīfa is probably responsible for the first codification work. You could probably say that he was probably the first person to fill this gap. As Islam spread, I mean 70 Hijri, 80 Hijri, when he starts doing his work, it's probably about 90 Hijri. It's very interesting where he came from and what's his life story. That's when he started doing his work, formulating the fiqh and jurisprudence. He was the first to try to codify it, to try to bring it together. Now, when something has been unprecedented, then there's only the very bold and confident and highly resolute people will probably try to go and fill that gap. Most of us are followers. Most of us just do what others do because we copy. because that's the safest way to do things. There's very few people who are actually willing to go out on a limb and do something different. Now, among those people, you've got those who go out and do something radical and different, who mess it all up. And then you've got those people who get it right. That's the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That's the tawfiq. That's a divine enablement from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Imam Abū Ḥanīfa blazes this path. So he's a pioneer, I would say, in extrapolating all of these extra issues, right? Including a lot of hypothetical issues. He literally had, you could say, a factory of fiqh, where he had this is what's different from his madhab to other madhabs, that he had approximately 30 people of various different proficiencies, whether that be in Arabic language, in hadith, in analogy, in analysis, and in Quran tafsir, and so on. And he had all of them together, and a lot of the masail, a lot of the rulings that have been formulated through him, they come through the committee. It's sometimes they've debated on issues for 3 months, and eventually it's like, okay, fine, if we can't come to an agreement, we're gonna record that this is his opinion, and this is Imam Abu Yusuf's opinion, one of his students. This is Imam Muhammad's opinion. This is Zufar's opinion. This is Hassan ibn Ziyad's opinion. So you've got that in those bodies of work that have been produced. You've got that in there. So let's go back to Imam Abū Ḥanīfa about what gives him this ability. Now that we've understood what he's been able to achieve, and this pioneering work. I personally believe that he's one of those people, and you get a few of those in the world at any given time. He's just one of those people who was a natural genius, extremely intellectual, right? In fact, there's one person who observed him sitting up and standing, sitting down and then standing up, and he says that this person is so intellectual, you can even see it in the way he sits and the way he stands. Now, some of us may just consider that to be an exaggeration, but I completely understand what he's speaking about. You may see somebody, the way they get in a car, right? Overcoming an obstacle. You know, there's a certain way they do things. You can tell that they've got a lot of experience in the way they do it to maybe avoid a particular accident, very efficiently. That's just a statement about him. Now, Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, what I love about him, right? And why he is a great role model personally for me, and I sometimes probably get very animated even speaking about him, though I haven't spoken to him about him for a very long time, is that he starts off as a businessman, a very wealthy businessman. Once he liked his fine clothes. He would pass by and you could tell he'd pass by because you could tell his perfume. Right? He used very expensive things, and he liked it that people had, and he spent a lot behind other people. So for example, there was one occasion when he borrowed somebody's garment. Can't remember exactly which garment it was, and then for that person it was a very expensive garment, right? And then he gave it back to him and he said, no, this isn't good enough. And a week later he was seen with a garment about 10 times that same kind of article of clothing that was about 10 times the amount. On one occasion, there was somebody who came to one of his gatherings and he had shabby clothing on. So as people were leaving at the end of the gathering, he told him to stay behind, right? So he could speak to him privately. And after everybody left, he says, okay, can you on the side there was his prayer mat. He said, pick that prayer mat up. Underneath it was money. He says, please take this and spend it on yourself. So the person, no, he didn't even say that. He says, you can take that money. The person immediately understood that he was trying to gift him the money. He said, I'm well-to-do, I've got money. So he said, why are you dressed in a way that makes people feel sorry for you, want to spend on you? Right? He was a major businessman, and it looks like he had quite a widespread business in clothing, garments, cloth sale. So he would deal in a lot of cloth, right? So anyway, whatever cloth he was dealing with, in those days, everybody had to do, you didn't get ready-made clothes from Next in those days. So cloth was a big business, I guess. So, however, you could tell that from before. On one occasion, it says that he was, there's a great, another tabi'i, whose name was Imam Abu Amir al-Sha'bi. Abu Amir al-Sha'bi once saw him, and he said to him, where do you go? Like, where are you going? He must have seen him passing by. He says, where are you going? He says, I'm going to such and such a business, such and such a wholesaler, trader, whatever. He says, no, that's not what I mean. I said, who do you study by? He said, I don't study with anybody. Now remember, he's older. He's 20 something years old probably, right? He's not as other people start at the age of 10. Or Imam Shafi, he had memorized the whole Quran, and he had memorized the Muwatta, which is the hadith collection of Imam Malik, right, by the age of 10 or 12. So when he went to Imam Malik as a young boy, and Imam Malik had already retired, right, and he said, can I study with you? So he looked at him and he thought, okay, this person seems very promising. So against his normal schedule, he said, okay, I'll teach you, but go and call one of my students who know the Muwatta. He says, I've memorized it, right? So he started very young. He died very young. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa started later. Obviously, he was a lot more mature when he started. So once when he said that to him, where are you going? And Imam Abū Ḥanīfa said, you know, I'm going to such and such a businessman. This was when he was passing this Imam Sha'bi's house. So he mistook him from one of his students. Says, where are you going, young man? Imam Abū Ḥanīfa says, you know, I'm going to see that businessman. No, he said, whose classes do you attend? He says, nobody, sir. I don't attend anybody's classes. So Sha'bi said, I see signs of intelligence in you. You should go and sit with the learned men. Right? You should sit with learned men. Now I'm going to say that here, anybody who thinks he's really good at science or whatever else you're studying, then I think you should go and study the deen. Right? I'm going to say that to you. I don't know you guys too well. I know a few of you, and I know one of you is supposed to be in class right now. All right? But I really think that if you're what Imperial College makes you out to be, right, and you think you want to change the world, then go ahead and study well in what you're doing here, but supplement that with that knowledge with your studying the deen. Inshallah, you know, with what intellect Allah has given you, maybe you could be the next Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, right? Why should you think any less than that, right? At least if you think that, you may get somewhere with it. And mashallah, you do have a few students here who are already doing that, and from other universities who are already doing that. So you should definitely think about it, right? I'm trying to be the Imam Sha'bi looking for the next Imam Abū Ḥanīfa. All right? And I'm not joking about this. Seriously, I'm not joking about this. We need a lot more of this. We need a lot more. The Ummah is calling, right? Let's not just revel in what these people did. They've gone, they've secured a place for themselves, right? We need to, inshallah, help a lot of people. Today we're sitting talking about him in Imperial College. He would never have even fathomed that idea that somebody's going to speak to me about this in a city which probably at that time, I don't know if it's called Londinium or what it was called at that time, right? And there's going to be a college there, and there's going to be, you know, somebody speaking about. He would never have guessed that. He would never have guessed that. But this is the wonder of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen. So anyway, he says, you ought to sit in the company of learned men. This sparked a new light in the heart of Imam Abū Ḥanīfa for studying. It seems like he first started studying theology, beliefs. And he, as I said, he was a natural genius. He became a master. I mean, he first does a very excellent business. His business carries on. He doesn't drop his business, by the way. He just gets others to manage it. So you can tell he's a very good manager as well in that sense. He then dedicates, initially I think he probably just dabbles in it, studying theology. Now he was in Kufa, right? Kufa is in Iraq today, right? It's not as well known, but it's there. The other city close by was Basra, like you can say the other city that both cities had been established during the time of Umar radiallahu anh. Basra had problems. Basra was where a lot of heretics, new ideas, radical ideas, crazy ideas were. So there were a lot of heterodox ideas there and people who held them. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa says that he went over 20 times, about 27 times to Basra to argue, debate with these people, and in most cases he managed to silence them, convince them, convert them, and that he was very successful in that. That makes a lot of sense. On one occasion, he had a style, he had a knack for speaking. When he spoke very clearly, very convincingly. He was able to be very convincing. That's just the natural trait that he had. In fact, when he went to Medina Munawwara for, during his pilgrimage, he went to Medina Munawwara, he actually met Imam Malik. They had a meeting. When he left, Imam Malik was asked, what do you think of him? Because his fame had spread everywhere. Everybody knew Abū Ḥanīfa, like, even before he became a great jurist. So clearly he's just come to meet Imam Malik. So it's like, what do you think of him? Right? What kind of he says, رَأَيْتُ رَجُلًا لَوْ كَلَّمَ, you don't have any here, but لَوْ كَلَّمَ هَذِهِ السَّارِيَةِ ذَهَبًا لَقَامَ بِحُجَّتِهِ. He says, I've just seen a man who, if he was to claim that this pillar was made of gold, he could probably establish proof for it. Like, he could convince you about it. Very convincing, very intellectual. So, as I said, over 20 times did he go to debate. However, on one occasion, he mentions that, they became so proficient in it that they became the authorities. People would literally point fingers at them that he's the man to go to in terms of jurisprudence, though he's not formally a student, it seems. On one occasion, there's a group of people. These people were known to be leaning towards atheism, right? They came to ask him some questions about God. So they came and said, we've got some questions. He probably knew about them from before. So this is the way he played it, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to remember that to convince somebody, there's a knack in the way you do so, right? You can use strategies to convince people. So what he said was, hold on, I can't speak to you right now. I've got a really important issue that I'm pondering over and it's occupying my mind, right? And it's really strange. So I need to deal with that question first. So they got curious and they said, what is the question? He said, yeah, I've just been told that there's a ship, right? A freight liner that's carrying a lot of freight, and it leaves port by itself. It traverses the waters, navigates itself, and it reaches its destination on its own. Essentially what he's talking about is a smart ship, right? Programmed, which today for us is very easy to understand. It's not even a matter of disbelief. You could probably control planes right now with with remote controls. They just probably need the guy because it's autopilot, isn't it? They just need the guy there to make sure, just like in a Tesla you need the guy to sit there even though it drives on its own. I've actually sat in a Tesla with that happening. It's quite interesting. But you just need a guy because they just can't trust it 100%. But in those days, for something like that, that was unfathomable. That was impossible for people to even think of in those days. So as he's explaining this story, those guys incredulously look towards him and say, are you crazy, or what's going on? How can you even believe in something like that? How can you believe that a ship travels on its own, right, without a navigator, without somebody controlling it? And that's exactly the response, or that's exactly the kind of response Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was waiting for. He said, this is exactly the point. He said, you guys have a problem with this world running without a creator, without a maker, without a designer, without an administrator. You guys find it not credible to believe that a ship can run by itself. How do you expect this entire universe to run by that? They were just dumbstruck, taken aback, and that helped them to understand the issue, and basically they repented from this these you could say these beliefs that they had, these doubts that they had come about with. Now that was a much more effective way than to sit them down and trying to give them proofs, because they probably heard them all. You can tell that he was just very good at arguing the case. As I mentioned, he's very wealthy. He has a student. So on one occasion, somebody came to ask him a question. A woman came to ask him a question. Remember, what happens in the world is you become good at one thing and you become very proficient. For example, there are several speakers out there who are very good at, for example, very good at interfaith dialogue, right? They know a lot about the Vedas, and they know about the Christian Bible, and they know how to debate that, and they've managed to convince a lot of people. They've got no backing in jurisprudence, though, for example, right? They've got no backing they've got no background in fiqh, in jurisprudence, or anything. Their main focus, like Ahmed Didat, rahimahullah, was wonderful in terms of his Bible studies, very good at convincing Christians, but he didn't have any kind of traditional hadith, tafsir, education at all, right? Now, what happens with a lot of these people, because they're very prominent, you know, you've got the likes of Zakir Naik, you've got a few other people like that, right? People come to ask them questions because they see him as a man of the deen, man of religion, that he's very good at one subject. And then the challenge there for such people is that, do they say, no, that's not my area, as mashallah some do that, right? Or do they just start giving answers? Most of the time, unfortunately, not very equipped answers. You can tell his intelligence that a woman came to ask him a question about the sunnah way to divorce. Maybe that was a discussion with her husband, that what's the sunnah way of divorce? And he was like, I don't know. He says, go and ask Hammad ibn Abi Sulaiman. That was one question. I think there may have been another question. She came back and she gave him the answer after she'd received it from Hammad ibn Abi Sulaiman, who was the great jurist holding the main classes in those days. When he came to find out about it, he says, you know what, I'm done with theology, right? I need to know these hands-on jurisprudence, everyday problems, right? So he took his shoes and he went and joined Hammad's lesson. Now, as I said, he's an intellectual, memorizes everything. He says, I used to memorize everything that Hammad used to say, right? To such a degree that the next day when we would be tested, I would be able to repeat everything correctly while others would make mistakes. Eventually, Hammad says that the prominent position in the class in front, only you're going to have. And then when Hammad ibn Abi Sulaiman, rahimahullah, when he passed away, everybody elected Imam Abū Ḥanīfa to take his position, and then he becomes the great scholar. He then becomes the great Imam as such. That's why out of the 4 Imams, in fact out of all the Imams and all the scholars out there, the only one who's been given this title, al-Imām al-aʿẓam. Al-Imām al-aʿẓam is Imam Abū Ḥanīfa. What does al-Imām al-aʿẓam mean? Al-Imām means obviously the leader. Al-aʿẓam means the greatest, the mightiest, right? The most proficient leader. To such a degree that if you go to Baghdad today, right? If you go to Baghdad in Iraq today, there's an entire area where majority of the Sunnis are. It's actually called Aʿẓamiyya. From Aʿẓam, Aʿẓamiyya. That's where his complex is. That's where he's buried, and that whole area is called Aʿẓamiyya. So, as I said, he's left a massive legacy, and highly intellectual, using his intellect. There's a lot of intellectual people in the world. In history, we've had a lot of intellectual people. Unfortunately, they just didn't leave a mark the way he did. Right? Because they just did what everybody else was doing. He did something different, right? And he got it right. He didn't get it wrong in doing different, right? You either get it wrong and become notorious, or you actually do something right and you become famous, well known, and you become prayed for, as he is. So, a few more things. When his students would come to class, he once had a student who was quite young at the time, Abu Yusuf, his name was. Right, Abu Yusuf, and after a few days of coming to class and showing a lot of promise, suddenly he disappears. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa goes to look for him and finds out that his father's not very wealthy, right, and he's pulled him out so that he can work for him. He can go and work and earn a living for the rest, for the family. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, I mean, you see, there's very few people who will have even a material ability to do this, right? He says to his father, I'll pay you whatever money he can make. You let him come to the class. This is what you call investment, right? Behind people who you can see. And that's why later the same Imam Abu Yusuf becomes the first person in the great Abbasid empire under Harun al-Rashid, the great Abbasid Caliph, which most people would have probably heard about. He becomes given the title, the Chief Justice, Qadhi al-Qudat, the judge of all judges. And he's very influential in the Abbasid court. He writes a book for Harun al-Rashid, and this would not have happened. He would have just basically receded into oblivion had he continued his work, his normal work. But Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, then you have another one who comes to study at an older age when Imam Abū Ḥanīfa is put into prison in Baghdad at his old age. He became a threat because Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who's before Harun al-Rashid, probably the greatest of the Abbasid Khalifs, before Harun al-Rashid, the second Khalif, he felt a threat from Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, which is probably misplaced. So he imprisoned him. He could still teach and everything, but he imprisoned him. And eventually they say that he was actually poisoned. And that's why he died. Allah knows best about that. But there's a young man who's just become mature, 13, 14 years of age, maybe even less, who starts to study with Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, and he becomes, in some sense, probably even greater than Imam Abu Yusuf, though Imam Abu Yusuf is his sheikh as well. This is Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, who then goes on to write at least 6 books in which he compiles all of the rulings of Imam Abū Ḥanīfa. As I said, madhabs proliferate through followers who will take your work and spread it. Imam Muhammad is considered to be majorly responsible. He found the value in it. And what's very interesting is this same Imam Muhammad, after he studied with Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, Imam Abū Ḥanīfa passed away, he went to Medina Munawwara and studied with Imam Malik. Imam Malik is his teacher as well. He comes back, he doesn't adopt the opinion of Imam Malik, even though Imam Malik was more prominently known as a hadith scholar. He continues with the Hanafi tradition. He is actually also a teacher of Imam Shafi'i, right? Wallahu alam, because Imam Shafi'i also met him. Now, the other thing that Imam Abū Ḥanīfa would do that was very different from a lot of other scholars in those days. See, today, scholars are employed. The way they make their money is they're employed either by masjids as imams or by schools or madrasas, and they get a salary. In those days, there was not much of a salary system. The way it worked was generally that there would be mashallah, there were a lot of charitable people. They would establish endowments, right? They would establish endowments like this is an endowment for the scholars of this school who are teaching here, or this is an endowment for the teachers of that school, or for the scholars of this city, or for the scholars of this area. These were endowments. Unfortunately, we just don't have enough of these today. That's why we've actually had to, the Imams and the scholars have actually had to start being employed as such. So they would receive money through these endowments, or they would receive money directly as gifts from wealthy people, which would then enable them to give lectures in the masjid for free and go and teach in their homes or in other places for free. There was no stipend as such. I don't think students paid in those days. I don't think there was a fee system. Wallahu alam. I haven't looked at this in detail, but that would have been a wonderful time. You could just go and study for free. You don't have to pay 9,000, 6,000, 4,000, 3,000, or whatever it was. All right. The only problem with that is sometimes you could be muzzled because of where your money is coming from. It's possible you have to be careful how you responded to certain questions related to that person or whatever the case was. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, the thing about him is a lot of self-dignity, and Allah had given him this business due to which he did not have to go to anybody. On one occasion, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur had an argument with his wife. They called in Imam Abū Ḥanīfa as an arbitrator, right? The argument was something about taking more than one wife or something, all right? Typical argument. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur puts out his claim. He says, "Ya Imam, tell me, isn't it right that a man can have up to 4 wives?" Right? So Imam Abū Ḥanīfa says, "Yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says so, it's right, yes." And then his wife must have said something. So Imam Abū Ḥanīfa then said, "But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only allows you up to 4 wives if you can do justice. And if you cannot do justice, then you're only allowed 1. Right? Now, that obviously silenced the whole issue, because that maybe the information he'd given originally was going to be abused, but immediately he understood the situation. He could have only done that because of independence. You're speaking in front of the Khalif of the Muslim world. I mean, not just of Kufa or Basra or Baghdad. Right? You're talking about the Khalif of the world, who could just literally snap a finger and have you killed. But he was able to do that. Later he goes home, and somebody comes with a huge amount of coins, gold or silver coins, that the queen has just sent you this. He says, "Please take it back. I did not do it to please the queen. I did it because I wanted the truth to prevail. So take all of this money back." He had the independence to do that. That's why one of the I consider this to be a sunnah of Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, that another thing that he used to do was that he used to dedicate a percentage of his wealth, of his income, a percentage of income for the scholars of the city. And that would be given to his students and the scholars of the city. I find that so amazing. The reason is that our deen, our religion, can only survive. We as human beings can survive with good jobs, right? With a degree from Imperial, you'll survive, inshallah, right? You'll more than survive, inshallah. Allah give you barakah. But will our deen survive? Will it survive in the next generation? Will it survive for the other people? That can only survive through scholars, right? That can only survive through scholars. If I'm going to help other scholars, especially those who are doing very good work, I'm going to help them with a bit of money here and there, then I'm encouraging them. I'm helping them, I'm assisting them. That means they can spend more time behind teaching and researching rather than finding a taxi job or something else. Not that, alhamdulillah, I don't think most do that anymore. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has enriched and has dignified the ulama, especially of this country, but I've seen this in other countries, all right? Some may still have to do a few side jobs, right? That they're not really, I know some people who, I know one person, for example, he's in another country, a Western country, and he gave up a big job in Cisco. He was making a lot of money to go and study. He studied for 5 or 6, 7 years. He became an alim. And now he's, mashallah, running, he is basically running a teaching school online as well. And he's getting by on a minimum because there's only so much money it can make, right? And his family is pressuring him to go back. His family are in high positions in these major tech companies. They can get him a job for over $100,000 tomorrow. But he's just resisting that. What have I spent 5, 6 years to do? I want to do that. I want to do that. You see what I'm saying? So there are still people like that. And Imam, this is what I call the sunnah of Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, that he would look after others. You can tell that, you see, when it comes to scholars, sometimes there's an idea of jealousy, that they may have more followers, others may get more followers. Why should I help somebody else? To be honest, if I help another scholar, he's doing the same work that I'm doing. He is trying to benefit the community. If I can facilitate for that person to benefit the community, it's going to make my job easier. We both have the same goal, right? We both have the same goal. So that's the way he looked at it. In fact, he would give crazy gifts to people. Once another muhaddith, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, came to one of his students and said, "What's wrong with the Imam? He gives so much gifts to us. He sends so much gifts to us." You know what I mean? Is, when you go to somebody's house, you take a box of chocolate, or you take some flowers, or if you're really tradition, you take some mithai, all right? You know what I mean? But if you go there with 5 bags of different shopping, you as a recipient of that, wouldn't you feel a bit awkward? Right? It's gracious to accept a box of chocolate, maybe 3 boxes of chocolates, maybe a bit more, maybe, a nice scarf, maybe you want. But imagine they do like loads of shopping for you as though it's your shopping, and you receive that. Wouldn't you feel a bit uncomfortable and embarrassed? So Sufyan ibn Uyayna felt like that. And he came to he met one of the students, or some of the students, and he said, "What's wrong with your Imam? This is the kind of gifts he gives." He says, "He hasn't given you anything. I mean, you should see what he gives us." All right? And the amazing thing is that his business was proliferating. And the other benefit of it is that he was very scrupulous. He was extremely scrupulous. He ran his business with absolutely no deception. He tried to make sure that it was completely legit. On one occasion, they had received these rolls of fabric. Problem was that some of them had a slight defect, right? Some of them had a slight defect. Now in fabric, you can't, unless you roll it all out, you can't see it. But he knew, and he was told that there was some defect. He sent it to one of his agents, and he told him that make sure when you sell this that you inform the potential customer about this. The person must have forgotten because he was getting a good rate, whatever, and he sold them off. It was a lot of fabric. And Imam Abū Ḥanīfa found out about it, and he said he was upset. He says, "Why didn't you tell him? I told you." He says, "I forgot." He donated the entire proceeds of that he donated, right? You can tell that when you do things like that, you basically save your wealth from a haram element, which pollutes the rest. It's like a cancer, essentially. People think that I can make more money by doing a few easy deals here. Easy generally means problematic, right? But the barakah is not there. The barakah is not there. The barakah is not there, right? That's just the way things are. When you make easy money, easy come, easy go. why is there criticism about him? Right? One of the major charges against him is that he opposes hadith and gives preference to opinion over hadith. All right? Now that's a very important thing. Now I've got my own theory about this. There's been a lot of responses to this and people have proven how many hadith he narrated and so on. But there's a few things I'd just like to mention very quickly. Number one, the Hanafis and jurists in general, their focus and interest is not in the preservation of hadith. What that means is their focus is not just to find a narration and preserve it and not do anything with it and just transmit it to the next generation, right? Their focus is to take that narration, extrapolate and distill rulings from it for the sake of the people. So there was a big hadith scholar during his time. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa had actually studied with him, meaning had heard hadith from him. His name was Abdur-Rahman al-A'mash. Right? Once A'mash had a question, a juridical question, right? So he asked Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, what is the answer to this? So he said, this is the answer. He says, where'd you get the answer from? So he says to him, you reported, he's addressing A'mash, he says, you reported to us from Abu Salih, who reported from Abu Hurairah. You also reported to us from Abu Wa'il, who reported from Abdullah. And you also, so he's talking about three narrations that you've reported to us, right? From Abu Ilyas, who reported from Abu Mas'ud al-Ansari radiyallahu anhu. So he's mentioning three people in between who relate from three Sahaba, all right? That the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said such and such. You also reported the same to us from Abu Mijlas, who reported from Hudhayfa, who from Abu Zubayr, who from Jabir and Yazid al-Raqashi, and they from Anas ibn Malik. Now A'mash explains, enough. What took me 100 days to narrate to you, you have repeated to me in just an instance. I was not aware that your practice was based on these hadith. Like, he didn't know that you could extrapolate these same rulings from the very narrations that he had given to Imam Abū Ḥanīfa himself. Right? And then he exclaimed, O group of jurists, O jurists, you are the physicians, we are merely the pharmacists. Right? How many of you being a doctor here? How many are you doing? It's generally everybody, right? Right? So, you are the physicians, we're just the pharmacists. Basically, the people who are going to tell you how to use the medicine, right, how to use the narration are different from the pharmacist, which is probably, rejects from medicine going to pharmacy, right? Isn't that what it is generally? That's what I'm hearing anyway. Sorry. Some people may have an affinity with and a love for pharmacy, so they go in directly, so let me not say that, right? God bless you in whatever you do. God bless you in whatever you do. So pharmacies, we need pharmacists, right? So pharmacists, basically, they store the medicine. Their job is to store the medicine, make sure it's in supply, and then dispense it according to the prescription of the doctor. So that's a decent analogy. Another thing is that I believe that Imam Abū Ḥanīfa's depth of understanding, the depth of extrapolation was probably missed by people. And they felt that he was actually opposing the narration because they couldn't understand his extrapolation. All right, and I've got a few things to back this up. Number one, when anybody actually questioned him about it, he was able to convince them, right? Generally speaking. Of course, there's always going to be people who never come to you and they criticize you, right? He's been praised by the greatest people anyway. The other thing is that Imam Muhammad, as I mentioned, he went to one of the greatest hadith masters of his time, which is Imam Malik, right? But he did not take his opinions. He remained a Hanafi even though he studied with him, which shows that the depth of understanding was fully comprehended by him. Then you've got this other story that's very interesting, that one of the other prominent students of Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was Zufar ibn Hudhayl. He was from Basra originally. Before that there was another student, Uthman al-Batti, I think. He left, he finished his classes with Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, he was going back to Basra. So Imam Abū Ḥanīfa gave him an advice. He said, when you go to Basra, nobody knows us there, right? So make sure that you don't start your own classes. You need to establish yourself first. Don't start your own classes, people are going to knock you out, right? Because they're very protective. But he went there, he was all geared up, he was all fired up, and he started his own class. And in just a few days, he started saying, Abu Hanifa this, Abu Hanifa that. and he was thrown out. Now, there was another student of Imam Abū Ḥanīfa also from Basra, because remember Imam Abū Ḥanīfa was in Kufa at that time. When he finished and he was going back to Basra, when he went, he actually joined in other classes first, silently. And when the discussion would start, he would provide the rulings that he had learned from Imam Abū Ḥanīfa without mentioning his name. Right, without mentioning his name. They didn't have anything against Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, they just didn't know him, and they were very protective over their own. So why should you go in? Why should you take from anywhere else? So slowly, what he started doing, there's another opinion in here which says X, Y, and Z. Slowly, people started paying attention to his opinions because they were very intuitive. They made a lot of sense. Even they said, where are you getting all this stuff from? Because one day it might be his own opinion, second day, but he seems to have a whole stream of really good opinions. Where are you getting this from? Oh, I studied with Imam Abū Ḥanīfa in Kufa. That's how the madhab of Abū Ḥanīfa eventually started in Basra, right? And that tells you how to work in a new community as well, right? So that tells you the profoundness of it once people get to access to it. Another story is that Imam Abū Ḥanīfa had another, Imam Muhammad had a famous student called Muhammad ibn Samā'a. Muhammad ibn Samā'a had a friend called Isa ibn Aban. Isa ibn Aban was a muhaddith. He used to criticize Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani and the Hanafis, right? If you could call them Hanafis at the time, because it was not fully developed, right? It only became known as Hanafis afterwards. Because remember, this is all developmental period at the time. He said, he used to pray with us in the same mosque, but then he would leave. He wouldn't sit in the dars, and he would complain that, oh, you guys oppose hadith. One day, I insisted on him to sit down and sit in the gathering of Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani. So he said that day he managed to sit, and after the majlis finished, I took him close to Imam Muhammad and I said, this is your nephew Isa ibn Aban, and you can tell he's he is very intelligent and he has a good knowledge of hadith, and I keep inviting him to you to your lesson, but he keeps saying that we oppose hadith, so he doesn't come, right? You can see that happening today. I mean, although it's kind of calmed down, but the last 15 years, this is exactly what used to be happening, right? So Imam Muhammad says to him, my son, tell me which issues, right? In which issue do we oppose hadith? So he mentioned a number of issues, and Imam Muhammad started answering him and telling him that, okay, the reason we don't take this hadith is because that's abrogated, this one, there's another one that opposes it, etc., etc., mentioned a number of dalail. And after we left, he turned around to me and he said that, you know what, there was a veil between me and the light. All this time there was just darkness for me, there was a veil between me and the light, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has now lifted it, and I never knew that there could be somebody who has this kind of knowledge, right, that's teaching people. After that, he went and he became a student of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, and then mashallah he became a great jurist, and then he actually wrote one of the first usul al-hadith works for the Hanafi school later on. So basically this just tells you that sometimes we may question people, criticize people without really knowing what they're all about, because it's a very superficial knowledge that we have about them. So it behoves us to check people out, right? Before we make certain judgments. And I just want to tell you his typical day, right, before we finish. You know what's very interesting? His mother had more respect for these other preachers. It's her son, she didn't respect him as much. So whenever she had a question, she would insist that he go and ask this particular preacher. And this just shows his mashallah obedience to his mother. Just to be respectful of his mother, he would literally go there and he would ask the scholar, that preacher. And the preacher was like, why are you asking me for? Right? He said, look, this is my mum. So if the preacher didn't know the answer, he would say, okay, tell me the answer. So Imam, when he would give him the answers, then he would repeat it. So he's like, here, and then he would tell. On some occasions, she wouldn't trust him. He said, take me to him. So she would be on the animal, the mule. He would ride with her to him, and the person would be embarrassed. And if he didn't know the answer, he'd say to him, what's the answer? What's the answer? He would say, oh, is this, and then he would just say, yeah, you're right. Right? So they would make this play just to convince her. Sometimes in his gathering, There would be people that would, maybe, you get that. I mean, just 2 Jumu'ahs ago, I started Jumu'ah in one place, right? And somebody stood up about 5 minutes into it, and he said, "You've come so late, and can you just quickly wrap it up?" What happened here, right? The others kind of started on and said, "Look, just leave it." Eventually we found out that because it was, the winter times, right? He thought it was 12:30, and this was now 1 o'clock, right? He thought it was already changed or something. So you get that. Now I try to keep my cool, right? Because otherwise it's very easy. You're in a position where people are going to listen to you anyway, and everybody is willing to grab them and beat them up, and So on one occasion, he told everybody to stop. He says, "Look, I'm in this place. I need to be able to listen to my criticism, then see whether it's right or wrong." One guy, he started criticizing him. He walked, even after the gathering, he kept saying things to him. Imam Hanifa said nothing to him. Eventually, he got to outside his house. He said, "Look, now I'm going to go into my house, which is my private property. If you've got anything else to say, just finish off here. I'm willing to listen to you. And then I'm going to go in." Right? He had a lot of forbearance. He was very calm, very quiet generally. And his daily routine was as follows. After the Fajr prayer, he would go and deliver a class in the masjid. And then after that, he would spend time responding to fatwas, questions people have asked him. They came from far and near. Then that was followed by another fiqh, that was followed by a session in which they would compile the fiqh with his students. That was a very special lesson. And whatever decisions were reached unanimously, they would then be recorded, right, which is found in Imam Muhammad's books. After doing his Dhuhr prayer, he would then go home, right? And then if it was summer, he'd have a little nap. Then the Asr prayer was followed by another session of teaching, after which he would then go around the city meeting friends or visiting the sick, condoling the bereaved, helping the poor. He would go out and do his external acts. After the Maghrib prayer, there was a third teaching session. How long is his day? It's like it's never ending, right? We don't even have that time. But that's because barakah. When you do things for Allah, you actually get more barakah in time. I'll tell you this from experience, right? And that would continue until Isha prayer. Now after Isha prayer, the Imam would start his private devotions, his private worship. Sometimes they would continue throughout the night. During winter, he often slept in the masjid until the Isha prayer from after Maghrib, after which he would spend much of the night in performing the Tahajjud prayer, reciting chosen passages of the Quran, repeating devotional formulas, and sometimes he performed them in his shop. Now clearly he had a family, because his son was Hammad ibn Abi Hanifa. He clearly had a family, but this is probably not talking about the way he did it throughout his life. This is probably later on, when he's probably retired from a lot of things. Maybe that's when he did this. I just want to put into perspective, because you're probably going to, what about his family, right? He's probably retired eventually at the end, right? He's old. Maybe that's when he was doing this. Wallahu alam. But there's a lot more to be said. There's major compilation biographies written about him. I've just tried to give you a kind of an overview of the most important things that I thought about him. Hopefully we can be inspired about this, and hopefully we can produce a few half Abu Hanifas, or quarter of them, or quarter Abu Hanifas, if not a full one, from this gathering here inshallah today. Otherwise maybe it's in vain, right? But we ask Allah for tawfiq. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Yeah, there's a few good books now. I mean, one of them is like a classic now, is actually this book here by Allama Shibli Nomani. I know it's got a pink cover here, right? There's other versions with different color covers. It's originally written in Urdu. It's a very it's a very well-researched book, and he's very clear because there are some quite fascinating stories related about him, and he kind of sifts out the kind of fascinating, possibly mythical, from the more realistic, and it gives a good understanding. The translation is half decent. So it's called Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, Life and Works by Allama Shibli Nomani. There's another one, can't remember who it's by, but there's a few out there. I'm sure if you do a search, you'll find a few others. And Imam Abū Ḥanīfa wrote several books. There's 5 books that he wrote in Aqidah, in theology. So I had the honor to actually write an English commentary on one of them, which is related to our belief system, right? Al-Fiqh al-Akbar. You see, fiqh, jurisprudence is called al-Fiqh al-Asghar. the lesser fiqh, because the higher fiqh apparently is the aqidah. So this is a commentary that I wrote on one of his books called Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, right, in aqidah. And yeah, so that there's a few good books out there on that. He wasn't a student of his. This is the Shia like to mention this as a student. What we mean by a student, let me get it right. He was a student and he was not a student. Depends on what you mean by a student. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa had approximately 400 teachers. All right. What we mean by teachers is not like here where you've actually taken a proper class with them and stayed with them for a sustained amount of time. All right. So, for example, I can say that I've got several teachers which are like that. Like I would say formal teachers that I've taken the bulk of things from and that have really had a major impact in my life. But then there's a few others that I've met and I've studied a few pages. Maybe I've heard one hadith from, two hadith from. So he has met, I believe, Imam Baqir and probably Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, rahimahumullah ta'ala, on different occasions. And with one of them, he actually had a nice dialogue. One of them said to him, I can't remember, I think it's Baqir or Ja'far Sadiq, I'm not sure which one, right? That I've heard that you oppose the narrations of my grandfather. So he says, how so? And then he explained to him that, look, I'll give you all of these examples in which, for example, if I was going according to logic, then I would have said that a woman should inherit the same as the man. But I don't, right? The masa on the socks. From a logical perspective, where should you be wiping your sock? Like that, 3 fingers on top, or should you be wiping the bottom, which probably gets more dirty? Right, logically. So he says, we do the top because that's what the hadith says. So he convinced him. So he probably learnt a few things from him, transmitted it, and he's been mentioned that there was no, as far as I know, there was no sustained, formal classes with him as such. The fatwas we're talking about here are not like the official kind of political, that's not what we're speaking about here. He avoided that entirely. He was not the Mufti of the country or the city. Are you from Malaysia?
Yeah.
Okay, I guessed that one. But the other day, I just actually 2 days ago, I met a Turkish scholar. Somebody said his name is Mufti Abdur-Rahman. So he says, oh, you're the official Mufti, right? The whole concept of Mufti for the Indo-Pak is very different from what's in Malaysia, Jordan, Palestine, etc., Arab countries, and what was the tradition then. So when we say he gave fatwas, these were not like official pronouncements from the government. He avoided that. In fact, he was impressed upon to go and become the judge, because he hated to swear the oath or make anybody swear an oath for something small. For example, once he was traveling with somebody, probably a friend or a companion. Somebody came and approached him, caught him up and said, you owe me 40 dirhams. 40 dirhams is about 48 pounds today approximately, right? It's a decent amount of money, not hundreds, but decent amount, right? And the person said, no, I don't owe it to you, right? It's paid or whatever it is. So the person said, swear an oath. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa saw that happening and he said, what's wrong with you guys? For such a small amount, you're making him swear an oath, right? That an oath has to be sworn. He pulled out the money and he gave it to him. He totally stayed away from anything official, as I mentioned. What we're talking about is, for the masses, he is developing a whole codified book of law. Like literally like a book of law or a body of law. That's what he's doing. The fatwa we're speaking about here is not official pronouncements. Though obviously whatever he said would be used by people, right? I'm going to attempt to answer that question. The question for the rest of you is obviously that what would be considered thinking outside the box today? What would be a contribution? And what are the requisite studies you would need to undertake such a thing? I guess we could probably brainstorm that right now, right? Because I've got certain ideas which, that's why we actually started White Thread Institute, because I felt that there were so many graduates of religious studies, but after they've graduated in Western universities, you have postgraduate studies. But we didn't have any postgraduate studies, at least in this country. We have in other countries. So that's why we started the whole postgraduate institute. So that's just to give you a basic idea. But for everybody else, I think what's required is that you carry on doing what you're doing, but also study the deen with seriousness. Not just haphazardly, but go and take a sustained study within your own fields, because I believe that communities that can have a very profound impact by people who are professionals. For example, I can speak to you, mashallah, you guys give me the respect, and you guys think me even worthy of speaking here, though I have no science degree, right? I've got a PhD, I don't know if that helps, but at the end of the day, I didn't study in Imperial College, right? I probably could have. I didn't even try, right? I went straight for SOAS because I was full-time. I just didn't want to mess around. Anyway, another story. The point is that if you've got people from a science background who study the deen, then there's a lot of people in science that can probably be influenced by this person, right? Who knows his science. I remember once I gave a talk in Southall, massive mosque, right? On the Broadway. They have several. They have a few thousand people for Jummah. I just quoted the CERN reactor and the bosons, and I just read about it recently, and I just quoted that. And there were several people that came. This is the first time they said that we've actually seen somebody quoting both the natural world and the spiritual world at once, right? So you've got a lot of people out there who have disenfranchised from their faith. You probably know people like that. They get so into everything else and they start looking down because maybe the imam in the masjid doesn't know this stuff, all right? And they think he doesn't know anything, right? Whereas he knows what's relevant to him. He may not know any science. So I think we need people in all fields, whether that be pharmacy even, right? Or because pharmacy, the ingredients, we need people to understand, because who's going to figure out, most tablets today, pills today have stearic acid to bind it together, generally, which is from an animal source. Nobody's speaking about this. I don't think the vegans have even picked this one up, right? We need to actually get them into it because they'll sort it out. We need people in every field that are doing their field and doing that as well, because that will give them the balance. And I guess maybe I'm not telling you what's needed exactly, but I'm telling you how to get it, right? We could, but we do need to brainstorm this, because I think this is a very important discussion, right? You guys brainstorm it, right? See what's out there that you're not finding something thing to, and inshallah we'll do it. I'll get our students to do it, and I think for the next time that I'm asked this question, I should have hopefully a list of things, right? I can't make up things, but nothing's coming to my mind, and nothing else is coming to my mind. But I've given you away. In the way they derive their rulings, how do the Hanafis differ from the other schools of thought? That's okay. When I was studying in Syria in 1998, there was a person I knew very well who worked in a bookshop, and he was also an advanced student. He was from a Shafi'i background, but he was studying Hanafi fiqh. And I remember once having a discussion with him, which only later resonated and I understood. He said to become a master of Shafi'i fiqh takes about 2 years if you did it full time, and you had the right set of the right set of abilities, and you had the right teacher. You could master it in 2 years. The Hanafi fiqh is a lot more complex. It's a lot more nuanced. It'll take 20 years, because the Hanafis are very pragmatic. They look at everything on a case by case. They've got general rules. They've got general usul, as we call them, right? The Shafi'is, their usul, their principles by which they legislate, are all codified in a book from the founder. So you've got Imam Shafi'i's al-Risala, which he wrote himself, and he wrote the foundational principles by which they legislate. You don't have any of these books from the founders of our school, of the Hanafi school. The usul of the Hanafi school have actually been distilled from their subsidiary law, all of their masail. That's where they've taken them out of. So they were more focused on actually dealing with the situation at hand. Of course they had their principles, but they never wrote a book on it, right? So Another thing, like if you look at the Shafi'is, they have wajib or fard as one category, sunnah as one category, though they have sunnah rawatib, they mentioned that, and then they have the other category. The Hanafis are they've got a very, the typology is actually very detailed. So you've got fard, then you got wajib, then you got sunnah mu'akkada, then you got sunnah ghair mu'akkada, mustahab, mubah, mustahab, sunnah ghair mu'akkada is very similar, then you got mubah. So their categorization is a lot more sophisticated, I would say. I mean, I would say that because I'm a Hanafi anyway. But their categorization, I believe in things, is very sophisticated. But I'm happy with all madhabs, right? This is not a competition. They've all done what they're supposed to do, and God bless them all. But I'm just saying, just to answer that question, that there's a level of sophistication, I would say, in the Hanafi school. The Malikis have also got that level of sophistication, or a level of sophistication. The other thing is that the Maliki and Hanafi schools have dealt with a lot of non-Muslims, and with Muslims as minorities. So we're talking about Andalusia. A lot was developed in Andalusia, which means in Spain, of the Maliki school. For the Hanafis, for example, the subcontinent, even before it broke up, the Muslims, though the Muslims ruled the subcontinent for many, many centuries, they were always a minority. I don't think they went beyond 15 to 17%. There was always a majority Hindu. So that's why India is actually a very good example for Western people. Pakistan is not, because Pakistan is a Muslim country. You can't analogize for the UK or America on Pakistan. That's a Muslim country. This is a non-Muslim country. You'd rather look at India and what the scholars did there and how they formulated their fiqh, all right, for centuries. So hopefully that gives some understanding of it. So there's actually a few things like this, right? The Prophet ﷺ said he was sitting with Salman al-Farisi radiyallahu an, right? I'm glad you reminded me of this. Salman al-Farisi radiyallahu an was a Persian. And the Prophet ﷺ said that لو كان هذا الدين عند الثريا لناله من هذه, right? If the deen was even on the Pleiades star, right? Thuraya is one of the stars, constellations up there. Even if the deen was up there, then one of his descendants, meaning one of his people, would go and bring it down. Imam Abū Ḥanīfa, in terms of ethnicity, was a Persian, right? His ethnicity was a Persian. But obviously, that tells us something else. How many Arabs are here? How many Arabs do we have here? You too? I'm an Arab. You're an Arab as well? So, I'm an Arab because I speak Arabic. That's one definition of Arab, is those who speak Arabic. And I think it's a fair definition, right? Because there's many Moroccans who have absolutely no Arabic background because they're Berbers. So I'm not going to call them Arab either, right? So if you learn Arabic and you'll become an Arab. So, but the thing that it tells us is that the deen, Allah will give it to whoever makes an effort. So you got a Persian, basically a non-Arab, and mashallah, look where he gets to. Bukhari was non-Arabic, right? Non-Arab. Tirmidhi was non-Arab. Muslim was non-Arab. Ibn Majah, all of these, the whole six, they were all from the Khurasan area, right? So it gives us a lot of hope. Yes, so the likes of Ghazali, Suyuti, etc., I believe they've all said that this hadith, if there's anybody that befits that description, is Imam Abū Ḥanīfa. There's a similar, not similar, but there's another hadith about the alim of Medina that the Prophet ﷺ spoke about. They say that's Imam Malik, right? And I mean, they definitely deserve it anyway. God bless them all.